A fall, a forgotten stove burner, maybe a break-in. If you live alone or someone you love does, maybe it's you now, or maybe it's your mother, and you're the one lying awake wondering. Phone on the nightstand just in case. Those are probably the fears that come to mind first, and underneath all of them sits one bigger question that rarely gets asked out loud. Does staying independent mean accepting more risk? Not the answer you're expecting. Here's the strange part. When you look at what actually changes a woman's health after she starts living alone past 60, it's rarely any of those three opening fears, the ones that keep adult children checking the porch camera one more time before bed. The real risks are quieter than that. They don't make the evening news, and they don't come with a siren. One of them happens in a kitchen. One happens on a bathroom floor, but not for the reason you'd expect. One happens inside a pill organizer with 7 little compartments. One doesn't look like a risk at all until you know what to look for. And the fifth one changes what the first 4 actually mean. Guess all 5 before we get there if you want. Most people get it most too. It starts somewhere you'd never guess. Dinner, and once you see it there, you'll start noticing the same pattern everywhere else in this list. Think about your last 7 dinners. Not what you meant to eat, not what a nutrition label would say you should eat, what actually ended up on the plate, on the night it actually happened. For a lot of women, especially the ones who spent decades cooking for a husband, kids, a full table, the answer changes the moment they start cooking for one. Not because appetite disappears, and not because anyone forgets what a healthy meal looks like. The problem isn't hunger, it's effort. Chopping a vegetable, seasoning a piece of chicken, waiting for something to finish on the stove for one plate starts to feel like a disproportionate amount of work for the reward. So on a tired evening, the instinct is to simplify. Toast instead of dinner. Cereal at 7 at night. A sandwich that quietly loses its vegetable side. Not because it wasn't wanted, but because cutting 1 carrot for one person can start to feel almost absurd. For many women, this shift happens right when it's hardest to notice, in the months after losing a spouse, when cooking for one isn't just less convenient, it's a quiet reminder of who's missing from the table. An empty chair at the table does something a grocery list never will. That instinct to simplify isn't laziness. It's grief finding a very practical outlet. When did you last cook something that took more than 15 minutes? Purely because you wanted to, not because company was coming. And here's what that shortcut quietly costs after 60. Protein. Skip a real portion of it often enough, and the effects don't announce themselves. They show up sideways: a jar that feels harder to open than it used to, a flight of stairs that suddenly asks more of you, a grocery bag that gets left for a second trip instead of carried in one. Nobody connects a loose jar lid to last month's dinners, but your body does the math even when you don't. By the time you've connected it back to dinner, months have gone by. The fix isn't becoming a better cook. It's having 1 or 2 protein-forward defaults ready before the tired evening arrives. Eggs with whatever vegetable is already in the fridge. A rotisserie chicken that turns into 3 meals with no real cooking at all, so exhaustion never gets the final vote. And rebuilding some version of the ritual helps too. A call with a friend while cooking, sitting at the table instead of eating standing at the counter. Neither of those takes more effort than what you're already doing. They just point the effort somewhere that pays you back. Eating alone is a habit you can make less lonely without making it more work. And the same problem appears somewhere you might never connect to food at all. Who currently knows your full medication list, every prescription, plus anything over the counter, plus any supplement a friend or a specialist recommended along the way? Not roughly, exactly, down to the dose. If you live with someone, there's often an accidental safety net built into that question, one nobody ever officially set up. Someone notices when the pill organizer looks off. Someone asks, almost without thinking, "Did you already take that?" And that casual question, the kind nobody would call a safety measure, catches an error before it becomes one. Living alone doesn't remove that safety net on purpose. It just isn't there anymore. And a lot of women don't notice its absence until something goes wrong. Picture a woman managing a blood pressure prescription, a thyroid medication, and a joint pain supplement a friend recommended after her own knee surgery. Each decision, on its own, was reasonable. But no single doctor ever saw all 3 together. Her primary care physician handled 2, a specialist handled the 3rd, and the supplement never came up because it didn't feel like a real medication. Nobody was wrong. Nobody was careless. That's the dangerous part. That kind of gap is common enough that pharmacists see it regularly, and it's exactly the sort of thing a full review is built to catch. Open your phone for a second. If a nurse asked you right now to name every pill, patch, and supplement you take, along with the dose, could you do it without walking to the kitchen first? A lot of people would have to check. And that's not a memory problem. It's simply that the list has never lived anywhere. A second person could review it, not a failure of memory, just a gap in the system nobody built on purpose. Notice, too, when these mistakes actually happen. Rarely on an ordinary Tuesday when the routine is intact. It's the week you catch a cold. It's the day after a grandchild's visit throws off your rhythm. It's the stretch right after a hospital stay changes 3 doses at once, and the old system hasn't caught up. A second person in the house tends to absorb exactly those disruptions without anyone noticing it's happening. Alone, those are the exact moments a mistake slips through. The dangerous days aren't the complicated ones. They're the days your routine changes. So keep it simple. One current, complete list. Kept somewhere, it can actually be found in a hurry, not just in your head. One trusted person who knows where to find it, not a caregiver. Just someone who could put their hands on it in an emergency. One pharmacist review a year, bringing in every actual bottle, not a list from memory, since memory smooths over exactly the small inconsistencies a reviewer needs to catch. That's the review that catches the thing no single doctor's visit would, a blood thinner and a common pain reliever that quietly don't sit well together. Depending on your insurance and pharmacy, it may be free or low cost. Nothing more elaborate than that. But medication isn't the only thing that becomes harder to track when there's no second person around. And it isn't the only place that missing safety net shows up. Sometimes the thing nobody notices isn't a pill, it's a person on the floor. You've probably already guessed that falls are a real concern for women living alone. That part isn't surprising, and it's probably the reason you clicked on this video in the first place. What might surprise you is that the fall may be only the beginning of the emergency, not the whole of it. The danger usually isn't the fall itself, it's what happens in the time after it. Even when the injury itself isn't severe, the time spent on the floor can quietly become the bigger problem. What consistently makes the outcome worse is how long someone stays down before help arrives. Extended time there, even without a serious injury, can lead to dehydration and a drop in body temperature that becomes its own emergency. Separate from whatever caused the fall in the first place, older adults tend to be more vulnerable to that, simply because circulation and temperature regulation shift over the years. A bruise heals in days. Hours on a cold floor can undo a lot more than a bruise does. Tuesday morning, 9:14 a.m. She reaches for a towel. Nothing breaks. She's not badly hurt. But she can't quite get herself up off the bathroom floor, and no one's expecting to hear from her until evening. She tells herself it's silly to make a fuss over nothing, so she waits. The minutes turn into an hour, then 2, and the cold tile floor starts to matter more than the fall ever did. So the fix isn't be more careful, which most women living alone already are. It's shrinking that gap on purpose, strength, and balance work, a few minutes, a few times a week to lower the odds of falling in the first place, and a fast, reliable way for someone to know if you go quiet, whether that's a medical alert device or a daily check-in text with a neighbor. Think of the device less as a symbol of fragility and more like a seatbelt, worn precisely because you're still active enough to be on the stairs or in the shower. Decide out loud who that person is and what a missed check-in should actually trigger. And if a fall involves a head injury, confusion, or an inability to bear weight, don't wait for the check-in system call for emergency help right away. If I fall tonight, who notices? Sit with that question for a second, because it's about to connect to something that doesn't look like a physical risk at all. Living alone and feeling alone are not the same thing, and that difference matters more than almost anything else in this video. Loneliness isn't simply time spent by yourself. Researchers generally describe it as the feeling that your connections aren't as meaningful or sufficient as you need them to be, separate from the fact that living alone can also mean fewer people around to notice subtle changes in you. Large studies on isolation in older adults have found real, measurable associations with it: higher inflammation, elevated blood pressure, greater cardiovascular risk, and researchers believe prolonged isolation may act as a chronic stressor on the body over time, in much the same way ongoing stress at work or in a relationship can wear on the body without a single dramatic moment to point to. Look at the last text message you sent. Who was it to, and how long ago was it? A woman can have a full, busy-looking week of errands and church and a standing lunch date, and still be carrying a quiet absence underneath it, because none of those interactions go deep enough for anyone to notice if something changed. She can wave to the same neighbors every week, chat with the same cashier, and still go days without a conversation that actually asks how she's doing and waits for the real answer. This risk can stay hidden for a very long time. A missed meal gets noticed within a day or two, but a slow drift into feeling unseen can go on for years without announcing itself. Think of the last 10 phone calls you made. How many were you checking in on someone else, and how many were someone checking in on you? The fix isn't a busier calendar. It's one standing point of real contact, a weekly call that isn't allowed to get skipped, a volunteer shift that puts the same faces in front of you regularly, a standing lunch with someone who actually asks the follow-up question. A single relationship that's honest and consistent may matter more here than a calendar full of shallow ones. What matters is whether it's steady enough that someone would notice if you went quiet. But now comes the part that changes the meaning of everything you've heard so far. Maybe by now, you've started thinking that all of this adds up to one conclusion. Maybe living alone itself is the problem. Sit with that for a second, because it's the natural place your mind goes after 4 risks in a row. Now go back through each story, slowly this time the way you'd rewatch a scene once you already know the ending. The plate with the toast where a real dinner should have been. The 3 prescriptions that never met each other on paper. The bathroom floor on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The full week of errands and lunches that still felt hollow by Friday night. Look closely at each one and ask what actually would have changed the ending. Being alone isn't the problem. Being unnoticed is. A dinner skipped once is nothing. A dinner skipped for months unnoticed is something else. A gap in the medication list is nothing, until it's paired with silence from everyone who could have caught it. A fall is nothing without the hours that follow it alone. 4 different situations, and in every one, the delay in someone noticing is what turned a manageable problem into a much bigger one, not solitude itself. Swap the setting in any of these 4 stories, same woman, same choices, same living alone situation, but with someone checking in on a regular rhythm, and the ending changes every time, without her giving up a single thing that made the day hers, and without anyone moving in. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Women who live independently after 60 often report higher measures of autonomy, identity, and life satisfaction than women who move into more supervised living before it's medically necessary. Not the story most people expect. Some of that difference exists simply because the women most able to stay independent tend to be healthier and more connected to begin with. That caveat matters, because it means this isn't proof that solitude itself is protective. It's a reminder that the 2 groups weren't identical to begin with. But it does undercut the fear that independence is inherently the danger, and that fear is often exactly what pushes families toward decisions made faster than they needed to be. Why does the opposite story stick then? Partly because of how these situations get talked about afterward once something's gone wrong. Living alone looks like the cause, when the real driver was how long the problem went unseen. Nobody tells the story of the thousands of ordinary Tuesdays that went by just fine, because nothing about an ordinary Tuesday makes for a good warning. And partly it's love, showing up as a dozen daily phone calls just to check, which can end up making a mother feel monitored instead of supported, without closing any of the gaps that actually matter. So before you go, here's the whole video compressed into 4 questions worth actually answering, not just hearing. 4 questions. That's it. Who would notice if your eating changed this week? Who has your current medication list? Who would notice if you didn't answer tonight? Who would recognize if you weren't quite yourself? Say your answers out loud, even if no one's in the room. Hearing yourself say, "I don't know," is different from just thinking it. If one of those was difficult, that's where I'd start. 1 phone call, 1 honest conversation, before anything forces the issue. Not a 5-year plan. Just the 1 call that answers the question you had the hardest time with. If you know a woman living alone who this described, it's worth sending her this not as a warning, but as something to bring up over coffee coffee the way you'd pass along anything else you thought she should know. And if this kind of practical look at staying independent after 60 is useful to you, that's exactly what this channel is for. We cover this territory regularly, one specific doable idea at a time, so subscribe if you want the next one. None of this is really about extending life for its own sake. It's about protecting the version of life you'd actually want to keep: your own kitchen, your own schedule, your own front door, the version where you're still the one who decides what dinner looks like tonight, without someone else's fear making that decision for you before it needs to be made. That front door matters more than it sounds like it should. It's the difference between receiving support and losing the feeling that your life is still yours, between someone helping you carry things and someone quietly taking them from you. Independence was never the risk. It's simply what you're protecting once the right people are in place to notice if something changes. You don't need someone living in your house. You need someone positioned to notice. This video is for general education and isn't a substitute for personalized medical advice. If you have a specific health condition or take multiple medications, talk with your healthcare provider about what applies to you.